we move into the fourth month of the war in Ukraine, the risk of escalation to a catastrophic nuclear confrontation between Russia and the United States remains a clear and present danger, whether accidental or intentional. While the probability may be low, the risk is increasing, and the fear of nuclear war is once again widespread. Nearly 70% of Americans surveyed by the American Psychological Association said they are, quote, worried the invasion of Ukraine is going to lead to nuclear war, and that they fear that we're at the beginning stages of World War III. What are the risks? What are the stakes? And what are the human and global impacts of this war? To shed light on these existential questions, we are deeply honored to have with us former California Governor Jerry Brown. He needs no introduction, but for those who may not know, just a few words about the governor. Governor Brown was elected trustee for the LA Community College District in 1969, California Secretary of State in 1970, and Governor of California in 1974 and 1978. After his governorship, he lectured and traveled widely, practiced law, served as chairman of the state Democratic Party, and ran for president of the United States. In 1998, he was elected mayor of Oakland and California Attorney General in 2006. He was elected governor again in 2010 and 2014. Governor Brown currently serves as the chair of the California-China Climate Institute at UC Berkeley, executive chair of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, and on the board of the Nuclear Threat Initiative. A very warm welcome to you, Governor Brown, and I just want to say thank you for dedicating your life to public service, for all you've done and continue to do on behalf of humanity to preserve and protect our future. We're so honored to have you with us.
Well, thank you very much. Very kind words. Pleasure to be here, even though the subject matter is very serious.
Right. Joining Governor Brown in our conversation today is my fellow Nuclear Age Peace Foundation board member, Richard Falk, a leading public intellectual and activist and professor emeritus at Princeton, where he inspired a generation of immensely fortunate students like me to embrace the vision of a world without nuclear weapons and become activists for nuclear disarmament. While still at Princeton, Richard organized a group of foreign policy advisors for Governor Brown's presidential campaign in 1976, and they have continued a dialogue over these many years on the most pressing global issues of our time, including the existential threat of nuclear war. We look forward to continuing this dialogue with all of you today. So we will have time for Q&A near the end of our program. So if you have a question, please type it into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible. So Governor Brown, I'd like to open by asking you the question. So many people here in our country and around the world are worried about the possibility of escalation to nuclear war over Ukraine. What are you most concerned about around the nuclear dangers arising out of the Ukraine war?
Well, what I see here is we have a serious war. First time we've had, well, I don't know how we characterize it, but to have Russia, a nuclear power, member of the Security Council, a longtime rival of America, and yet a very important player in Europe, invading the Ukraine. And they have many reasons for that. But nevertheless, Ukraine has constituted themselves for decades as an independent nation, and that has been recognized by Russia itself, as well as others at the time the Soviet Union broke up and Ukraine gave back the nuclear weapons that were on their territory. So this breach by Putin is very serious, but the implication is even more serious, and that is the killings and all the horrible things that have been reported. So now we're in a full-scale war. We have two sides, thousands of men, some women, shooting missiles, bullets, whatever they can to kill the other side. So this creates great horror, deep feelings that'll escalate. It's not stable. There's a demand, a calling out for vengeance, for retribution, for whatever. What do you do when your family, your wife, your children, your city has been annihilated? All right. Now, on the other side, the Russians are taking casualties too. So they're going to frame it from their point of view, and they're going to feel just as aggrieved in their own way. So we have two fierce, aggrieved parties killing each other. And for the most part, it's Russia destroying the Ukraine. So how does that do anything but escalate? Now, Ukraine is saying, and many senators in America are saying, push the Russians right back out of Crimea and push them back. Now, I don't think Putin is going to accept that without putting up quite a fight. And in putting up quite a fight, first of all, we don't know whether Ukraine's going to even be able to advance that far. The Russians have a lot of capability. They can bring that to bear, and they can push the Ukrainians back. But let's assume, so if the Russians don't, well, they could get to a stalemate position, or the Ukrainians could push them back. At some point, Putin may decide that he needs something stronger, like chemical weapons or anything like a tactical nuclear weapon. He's already taken a very bold and I would say outrageous move to invade and to kill and to destroy. So moving that up, most people were shocked. A lot of Russian scholars were very shocked by this. So he is a risk taker of some kind. So we might think that using a tactical nuclear weapon would give him the leverage, psychological, politically, geostrategically, whatever words you want to use. He could see that as a move that would work for him. If he did that, then there'll be great cries on the US to meet that tit for tat. Then what does Putin do? So we're here at the threshold of the nuclear escalation ladder, which Putin has put his toe on. Where does it go up? That's the danger that I see. And the driver is the killing, the deep grievance and feelings, emotions on the part of human beings here. This is not a think tank exercise by cold-hearted Rand Company analysts. These are deeply feeling human beings that are killing each other, and they're not going to say, oh, let's make a deal. Henry Kissinger said, let's make a deal, but he was doing that from Zoom into the safety of his Connecticut home, I presume. Good idea, but how? That's the problem. The way forward appears to be more killing, and the best we can hope for is enough killing, but not so much that it's completely unacceptable, and then we get a stalemate, and then we get a deal. We could have killing and stalemate like the 38th parallel in the Korean War. This could go on a long time. Who knows? I don't think Putin wants to be humiliated. I don't think he is going to give up options that he can take, even though the risk of those options would be unacceptable to a lot of other people. So Putin has put his toe on the escalation ladder, and what he's going to do next, we don't know. And I think that's the danger. And then we have the China-Russian alliance, and we have the American rallying to the cause, all other nations which are currently being called democratic, even though that word has many meanings to encompass the Philippines and Brazil and Hungary and a lot of other, and India and a lot of other places. But there it is. We have almost a 30 years war mentality between Lutherans and Catholics. Only this is the Democrats in the church of the rules-based order, norm-based order, versus the interest-based order of the Chinese and the Russians. And it's highly ideological, it's interest-based, it's very strong. And for now, I don't hear the United States saying they're in any mood to make a Kissingerian deal. I think we're going to have to. I think we should. It's not that it's good, but the alternatives are much, much worse. So prudence dictates a very cautious, incremental approach here. But I don't see any evidence in the public media of that somebody is looking to that Ukraine. They seem prepared. They want to fight more, and they feel very strongly. The Russians don't look like they want to say, "Okay, we lost." So there we are. We are in the middle, not at the end.
Thank you, Governor Brown, for those very sobering words and for really so eloquently laying out where we are, that we're really on the threshold of the nuclear escalatory ladder, and bringing in the complexities of the global context, the China-Russia alliance, and the trauma that is going on every day, that the killing continues, and the feelings that are worsening and risk escalation rising. So thank you very much for that. Richard, I'd like to ask you if you'd like to comment on Governor Brown's introductory words.
Yes, thank you, Cynthia. I agree with the tenor of what Governor Brown said. And I think particularly toward the end, his emphasis on the preferable path to take, which is one of seeking to find a diplomatic resolution of this war, which the longer it goes on, the worse it is for Ukraine, among other things, and the worse it is for the rest of the world. The food and energy shortages that will cause many people who are living at the edge anyway to suffer greatly. So the casualties of the Ukraine war have to be seen in a global context, especially because Russia and Ukraine are such important exporters of food and energy. Beyond that, I would have emphasized somewhat more than Governor Brown did what I feel is the unconstructive role American diplomacy has played, particularly in what might be described as the second phase of the Ukraine war. At first, I think the US properly came to support the defense and resistance of Ukrainians to this Russian aggression and violation of the most fundamental norm of international law. But when that resistance turned out to be stronger than expected, Washington and the Biden administration seemed to change their priorities from helping Ukraine resist to the point where they can find some kind of accommodation with Russia, to inflicting a humiliating defeat on Putin and Russia. And that made it into what I call a geopolitical war, rather than a war limited to the interactions of Russia and Ukraine with outside support. And this geopolitical war is aimed, as Governor Brown suggested, not only at Moscow, but also at Beijing. And it was reinforced by Biden's recent Asian trip, where he unnecessarily made this provocative statement about the US being committed to the military defense of Taiwan, which in effect was an accusation that without such a support, China was ready to invade Taiwan. And so it was unnecessarily provocative and confrontational, and combined with these hostile alliances that have been forming around China and Russia. And what is at stake really is the structure of global power after the Cold War, where the US initially emerged as the only global superpower or country with a geopolitically active role everywhere on the planet. And one way of looking at both what Russia has done and what China seemed non-militarily to be threatening was this primacy of the US after the Cold War. And a lot of people in the global South would rather live in a multipolar world than in a world that is dominated by one country. And so I feel it's very important in understanding what is at stake in Ukraine that one differentiate between the well-being of Ukraine and peace, stopping the killing, the ceasefire, and these larger geopolitical stakes. And in my view, responsible statecraft by the US would involve calling for a diplomatic process and stopping the killing being emphasized as a priority. And I haven't heard those words come from Biden in all these months. There's been no suggestion. In fact, the opposite. There's been this emphasis on the dehumanization, the demonization of Putin, and the emphasis on militarily resolving the circumstance, and no even thought that it would be desirable to find a political solution, which will come eventually, but eventually means that hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people will pay the price of delay. So there is an urgency about pursuing and seeking a diplomatic way of stopping the killing. And I haven't seen that any sign that Washington is interested in that as yet.
Well, you make a very valid point here. And I would just elaborate on that and say that the way I see it, the US position, as articulated by Biden, by his general there, it is very bellicose and aggressive. I think what it comes from, people, they see Putin as the embodiment of evil. Now, I want to stipulate that Putin has various degrees of evil, bad. He's done bad things. All right. And so did the communists when they were in charge. Nevertheless, America found a modus vivendi with Khrushchev, with Mao Zedong. This happened. And the people who forged this, who recommended it, George Kennan, for example, and Richard Nixon, and Henry Kissinger. And then and I know there's a little, people in Washington will say this is evasive, off the point. I don't think it is off the point, because it explains the attitudes that are fixed, that are so antagonistic, and that are supporting the war effort. All right. Now, we know at the time that the NATO expansion was considered, that George Kennan opposed it, Bill Perry, the Secretary of Defense, opposed it. All the Clinton people were for it, including Biden. But it was not just them. Paul Nitze, who was a very strong nuclear advocate, Cold Warrior, he personally had a great hand in killing Saul II under Carter. That was Paul Nitze. He opposed it. So did Richard Pipes, another rather hawkish man in the Reagan circles. He thought it was a bad idea. Of course, today people say, if you can bring that up, you're kind of a dupe. You're some, word used to be fellow traveler. But nevertheless, there were serious people. So let me fast forward now. I believe that anytime you talk diplomacy or you talk non-war, it looks like you're excusing bad, horrible things that Putin has done. But I want to juxtapose that Nixon, now a lot of people don't like Nixon, a lot of people don't like Kissinger. but you can't say they're not smart, and you can't say they don't know a lot about things. And whatever their other flaws, I mean, coming from my point of view, I don't believe any human being is perfect. And I do think that they were able to deal with Mao and the Russians and the Soviets in a way that is more balanced than we're dealing with it today. So what is called for is diplomacy. But I believe the belief system operating in the minds of those in charge makes that virtually impossible, because they are attributing such evil to the other side that it doesn't permit any kind of agreement. And I would say that, and I want to cite Kissinger on that, because I've not only talked to him personally, but he's spoken just in the last week on Zoom at Davos, where he said that you can't just draw China and Russia as only adversaries. And he linked that with the statement that weapons that are now in the hands of leaders are more destructive than ever before, unimaginable. So when you take the unimaginable destruction that is now before us and is available, and then you take, are we going to have only military killing means to resolve, or are we going to talk? And I would say the talks can't take place because of the perception of the goodness on one side and the utter depravity on the other. And unless somehow some sensibility, such as Reinhold Niebuhr advocated, or as Kissinger, who's a very flawed vessel in the minds of many people, not a perfect guy, but he's talked to Putin 15 times. He's talked to Xi Jinping many times. He believes that there are ways to work out a modus vivendi. I believe that, but I believe that the people who are in charge have belief structures presently operating in their minds that make that impossible today. And so the great challenge before America is to somehow get our leaders open to the possibility of talking to Putin. I think our president only spoke to Putin twice, has only spoken to Xi Jinping twice by Zoom. This is not smart. These are big leaders who control big bodies of people, and yet that is subordinate to these other passing issues in Washington. So I would just say our problem, and I think Richard was indicating that by saying he liked my tenor, but he had some questions, I think, about my substance. Well, the substance I want to put on this is that we have belief systems operating. Putin's got a belief system. But at the end of the day, I like, and I agree with what Gregory Bateson wrote when I had him as a regent and in the University of California, the great anthropologist. He said, arms race, which we're in an arms race. The only way an arms race ends is in Armageddon, annihilation, or trust. There's only two outcomes. So if you're going to relate by mutually scaring, that's called arms building, deterring, and escalating, it's going to end, somebody's going to use it. It's going to happen sooner or later. Or you're going to move to positions where you can find a way to have the other guy live with you and you with him. That's the task before us. And I don't see any evidence that key leaders in Washington, maybe even in Great Britain, Australia, other places, even believe what I said makes any sense or has any possibility. I hope I'm wrong, but that's what I think.
Can I just add a footnote to?
So please tell me I'm wrong, Richard. Tell me what
not you're wrong, but I would have you recall the period where, at the height of the Cold War, where Stalin was much more tangibly evil than Putin, given all that he did with the those camps, death camps throughout the country, and his general repressive behavior. But we understood that had we intervened in Hungary in 1956, in order to defend Hungary against a brutal Soviet intervention, that would have meant World War III. And so we refrained several times from challenging Russia, Soviet Union on their, within the Warsaw Pact context. So the mentality of the Cold War was also a good and evil mentality, but it was combined with this kind of Kissingerian geopolitical realism that seems to be missing in Washington these days.
Yeah, and we also had a president by the name of Dwight Eisenhower, who went through World War II. I think his training, his education, I think he was unusual in the history of our recent presidents. Let me put it without casting any aspersions. I'd have to say, and I just think Eisenhower, even though I think he threatened to use nuclear against North Korea. So there's some, the more you dig into this stuff, it's not pretty. So whatever that is, we did get along. We found a way to work with Stalin. We have to find a way to work with Putin. The nuclear thing, the nuclear threat is not just by getting in a war with Putin deliberately, but it's accident, or it's miscalculation, or it's some hot dog Air Force pilot that bombs into Poland, or some on either side. This thing can be started. Putin, even though he has a lot of, from what I hear, people who are great students of his, he feels very confident in the control of his nuclear weaponry. According to my friend Bill Perry, and also other people that seem to know a lot about nuclear weapons, the system is not that airtight. It can fail, and it's almost failed a few times before. So if for no other reason, we have to get on a understanding trust path. I know to use the word trust in this context is almost blasphemous from the current order. But you have to find, not that you think the other side's a Boy Scout, but you have to find a way for people to talk together. Mafia bosses could talk together. Leaders of Russia and the US have got to find a way to do that. But it doesn't seem that we're moving in that direction. And vis-a-vis China, there seems to be almost a delight in pointing to the bad things that China is doing, while at the same time never owning up to some bad things we did. And they were very bad. And most of them are never talked about, at least by the big shot politicians. So we are, not only are we in a bad place in Russia, but we're getting into an increasingly worse place in Asia. And I would say, whatever Biden was going to say on that trip, I wish he'd said, no matter what, we got to partner with China on climate, and we ought to partner with them on dealing with the virus because it's mutating and it's going to kill millions of more people. And you know what? At the end of the day, in 2008, as some key economists have said, we would have had in the world a global depression like that of 1930, but for the cooperation of the People's Republic of China and the United States. These two behemoths put up their $1 trillion to soften the blow. Are we going to throw that out the window? And the next time this crazy global economy goes in the tank, are we going to sit there and be disentangled from China in a way we can't work together? So like it or not, we are doomed to cooperate. And if we don't cooperate, we're doomed. That's simple.
Very good.
So I guess that pretty well says it.
Well, I just want to thank you both for all the important things you've been reminding us of, and to highlight what you both said, the importance of calling for diplomacy and keeping a dialogue, restoring a dialogue, especially at this time, and really realizing our larger shared interests. We have our differences, but as you both have pointed out, we have this larger shared interest in preventing a nuclear war, in addressing climate, as Governor Brown has said, as addressing the pandemic and so many other things. So, but we had another question that.
Can I throw in one more
Yeah,
point?
please.
we got another problem. And it's unseemly to admit that we have these flaws. But trained as I've been in Catholicism, I once wanted to be a Jesuit priest. I studied for 4 years, and we were hammered with the idea of how evil human beings are, how bad we were, the best of us. So I think America has to be able to entertain the idea that we can do very bad things, but you don't hear much of that. And if you don't have that level of clarity, and I would add to that humility, then you're into hubris and blindness. And that's, I'm afraid we have a lot of that. But just pointing to our country right now, we have millions, maybe tens of millions of people who think Trump won. So there's no fact-based judgment here. It's just a belief. They want Trump, therefore Trump won. There are millions, I don't know, not as many who believe Trump won, but a lot of people in the millions that believe Satan was responsible for putting Biden in the White House. All right, so we have those beliefs, but they're not over in the margin on a mountaintop. They are very much at the center of a political party that is poised to take over the Congress this November. And I would say be odds-on favorite to supply us with a president. So if Putin has some very bad beliefs in his brain, and if Xi has some very bad beliefs, America's got some bad beliefs. In fact, they're not in your head, or maybe my head. They're still circulating, and in our way of choosing, they may well ascend to the position of leadership and control. So I think we have to be very humble. I guess that's a word you don't like, because how can you have 6,000 nuclear weapons and be humble? But we need to face that. So I think our work is to understand more. And another thing Gregory Bateson said, and he was one person who I really thought had clear ideas. What he emphasized was clarity and caring. Clarity to see through the muddle that he thought most thinking was muddled. But then also, it's not just clarity, you got to care. And I would say in Washington, the caring looks dubious. I don't see enough of it. And the clarity seems to be totally overtaken by muddle, a lot of muddle. So our work has to be bring clarity to this muddled situation while we can. And that's what I'm working on. But boy, it's gotten tougher in the last 3 months.
Thank you, Governor Brown, for calling for introspection and reflection and clarity and humility. And at this time, as we really reckon with the existential threat to life on Earth. Richard, I wanted to turn to you in asking the next question. If we want to move now to the question about the treaty, the NPT treaty, if you'd like to ask that question.
Yes, I mean, I think one of the things that's been forgotten in relation to the nuclear threat has been the fact that decades ago, the United States, along with a lot of other governments, but we were the leader, signed a treaty which included a clause, Article 6, that committed the nuclear weapon states to seek in good faith complete nuclear disarmament through a reliable, verifiable, monitored process. And that article, vital for persuading the non-nuclear countries to accept the obligation never to acquire these weapons, has been fundamentally breached, in my view. There is no active intention to seek nuclear disarmament, despite this clear international law mandate, which the World Court, the International Court of Justice, in an advisory opinion in 1996, reinforced unanimously by saying this was a urgent and solemn obligation of the nuclear weapon states. In response, the US-led Western nuclear powers have not only refused to take any credible steps in the direction of exploring even whether such a treaty process is negotiable, they haven't been willing to even commit themselves to a no first use policy. They want the discretion to use and threaten these weapons, and yet when this veiled Putin threat comes, they act as if he is somehow committing a war crime by making such a threat. And in a way he is, but it's not qualitatively different than the posture that the NATO countries have been taking toward the nuclear weapons issue. This is reinforced, in my view, by the efforts of the global South to bring pressure to bear on the nuclear weapons states, partly by the negotiation of the Treaty of Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which came into force in early 2021 and has been effectively denounced by these NATO countries in a formal statement in which they said that we believe that deterrence and nuclear weaponry, the continuous development of nuclear weaponry, is the only way to achieve security in the present world. So we have a situation where there's a clear, flagrant violation of international treaty law, and there's nothing done about it. It provokes dissatisfaction, but the geopolitical actors in the world are not responsive to public opinion or to their legal obligations when they don't want to be. And so I feel it's imperative that civil society awaken to this situation where nuclearism is firmly embedded in the foreign policy and security policy of the United States, and it is viewing with cynicism a solemn treaty obligation to explore the prospects of nuclear disarmament. And just one further concluding observation about this is that the whole idea of seeking to having a security policy that is premised on the commitment to destroy tens of millions of innocent lives, plus the great danger to agriculture and the climate brought about by the so-called nuclear winter aftermath of any kind of major nuclear threat, really makes it urgent to engage with this issue in a serious way. And that's what we at the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation have had for decades, the commitment to take seriously this danger and this alternative, which leads to a peaceful and better world. And our hope is that through the awareness, the increased awareness of the nuclear threat that has arisen in the context of the Ukraine war, more and more people in this country and throughout the world will recognize not only that we have to abolish nuclear weapons, but that that is a precondition for the kind of cooperative world that can address problems like climate change and pandemics.
Let me just add, because you've rightly described the attitudes of NATO and certainly the American leadership wanting this extended deterrence, threatening nuclear to offset a conventional attack, among others. But I was at Monterey at the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies. I heard the number two man the deputy under Lavrov, and he just railed against the ban treaty, the treaty to ban nuclear weapons. So the Russians were very strong against that. I've heard some former French defense minister same way. So the nuclear powers don't like the ban treaty. That's we have to, and it's shared, not just the U.S., which they don't like it either, but neither do the Russians and the other nuclear holders. But and second, that Article 6, it has some weasel words. It says negotiate. No, it says in good faith to negotiate on, or it's got about 3 words before you get to total disarmament. But one thing that I do think is clear in Article 6, that you're supposed to negotiate to get to this disarmament goal seriously. And there is no evidence that's been going on. I mean, there's no, there was a little bit on the START 3, but not at the level that is needed. And certainly when Bush abolished the ABM treaty, where was the outcry? Very little outcry. Most people don't even know it had happened. And yet it's one of the decisive moves toward escalation that have been taken. So Article 6 is certainly being breached and ignored. It's mutual, all these nuclear powers. And I would say, I was on another dialogue with Russians, People's Republic of China, Koreans, South Koreans, and Japanese. And the South Korean guy made very clear how important extended deterrence is. And for those of you who may not know, extended deterrence means the US will threatens to use nuclear weapons if somebody invades South Korea. The same thing is true in NATO. Biden was flirting with adopting a no first use, never be the first country to use nuclear weapons. And he talked to his European allies. They said, no. They, in effect, not their words, but their concept, they only want to live under the nuclear umbrella. They want to feel that if Russia comes at them, the US will use nuclear weapons. They probably don't think of it that way. They think as long as the US will threaten nuclear weapons, then Russia will never show up. The great flaw in all that, deterrence is really another weasel word. Yes, you can deter people, but deterrence can fail. Deterrence is not an ironclad block. It is a threat of force to induce a psychological state that inclines the adversary not to attack. Doesn't mean the adversary won't attack, and it doesn't mean he might attack by accident or mistake, or maybe there might be a miscalculation that might encourage a decision to attack. So this idea of extended deterrence, where the US uses their nuclear weapons to destroy as a way to scare Russia or China into not interfering with our allies, that's a very dangerous business. And I would just juxtapose that with just 7 or 8 years ago, Kissinger, George Shultz, Republican, Reagan cabinet member, now dead, the age of 100. Kissinger, 99 today. Perry and Sam Nunn. They wrote several Wall Street Journal articles on the steps needed to get rid of nuclear weapons. Nothing like that has been written in several years, certainly the last 5 years. No big people talk that way anymore. So people wonder, what can we do? We have to get into the discussion in Washington, serious consideration of reducing and ultimately headed toward elimination of nuclear weapons. Maybe they'll never be eliminated. But between having 50 and having 5,000 is quite a difference. And now we see China, Trump was saying, well, we got to get China in any kind of negotiation. Well, China's only got a few hundred, 300 or 400. They want to go to 1,000 probably. Okay, we're at several thousand. So China's saying, well, when we get to you, let's talk. Well, the only way we get to talk now is we eliminate our nuclear weapons and get down to where China is. We're not about to do that. So in my view, this nuclear group, I think it could rightly be called a priesthood, but not a very holy priesthood. Very esoteric, very fine-grained details, but deep, deep belief in the power, in the virtue of having a weapon that can destroy millions, tens of millions, or maybe billions if nuclear winter comes to occur. That is a comfortable feeling. When I went over to Los Alamos, Lawrence Livermore, and got a briefing on all this, he took me, you go through and you take off your watch and everything's very secure. And they show you one of these nuclear weapons. It's not, I don't think it's not loaded or anything, but it's one of their older weapons. And it looked to me almost like it's in a kind of a shiny case. I almost thought it was gold. It was like a tabernacle. And I really had a sense of religious awe. We were here, this was the, some kind of holy of holies here. So I use that language to indicate the deep-rooted quality of the current pattern of belief, activity, and policy on the part of the US, Russia, and I presume China and the others. So there's a lot of intellectual excavation needed to clear away the debris, to get those folks in Washington just to consider moving in a more rational direction. A very good marker of where we are or where we're not is, will the Congress put back into the budget the low yield submarine launched cruise missile that Biden took out? He took it out. I think the committee in Washington is going to vote it back. Maybe today, maybe tomorrow, maybe next week. Well, that means we're going in the other direction. You got to fight that. And then you get that, you got to keep going. So I'd say we're still moving in the wrong direction. We're increasing, we're escalating, and the rate of rise is accelerating, and the direction is toward destruction. So we got to somehow reel that back and get people not to expect perfection right now. We just have to get to clarity. I'd almost say we need to get to cynicism, which means we want to survive, and then get to virtue, where we might be able to get some collaborative measures and engage in what I call planetary realism, not this crackpot realism that C. Wright Mills termed, or what I would even call this very regressive, very stunted 19th century nationalism. And when I see the talk now, it sounds like things I read about from the 19th century or pre-World War I. It's the same mood and no sense of the global insights that we now have from climate, from the power of nuclear weapons, from the runaway dangers of AI, artificial intelligence, or the power of space when it's militarized, or the mutating of plagues, either naturally or by some crazy group. It's getting cheaper all the time. So there's a lot of rationale, which is what Kissinger said. The horror, the destructiveness has reached an unprecedented degree. That should motivate people, no matter what their other problems are. So I think it's that larger context. But as I say, with the Ukraine war going full bore, with buildings and bombs flying, buildings being hit, we need some wiser minds. And as yet, I don't see any evidence of that. It's like a football game. It's like some football game where you have two sides that are rooting, but it's not a football game. It's planet Earth, and Earthlings are acting really stupid and dangerous. And we have to find a way of that common destiny, common experience that we all should understand. And it's possible, but I don't see it in the Democratic Party, Republican incumbents. I don't see it over there in Russia. I don't see it in NATO. I don't know where it's going to come from. Civil society, if you're out there, you better stir yourselves. We had them, I think, 40 years ago. I think in 80. Well, this is the anniversary of having 1 million people throughout the country protesting nuclear weapons. Well, we better get back to that or something equivalent, because right now it's stasis. No, it's worse than stasis. It's acceleration on the road to destruction.
Thank you, Governor Brown and Richard, for reminding us of what's at stake, the challenges that we face in getting to what you said, Richard. Abolition is a precondition for cooperation and survival, and the opportunities and your clarion call to action, Governor Brown, to civil society, which is what moved the needle back in the 1980s and made the huge difference to get us to reductions in our arsenals. I'd like to move now. Thank you both, and move now. We have lots of questions, and I'd like to start with a question from Katrina vanden Heuvel, who's the editorial director and publisher of The Nation, who's on the call and would like to ask you both a question. So I'm going to welcome Katrina to do that.
Thank you, and thank you for your clarity, Governor Brown, Professor Falk. Siegfried Hecker, who used to run Los Alamos, said something you just said, Governor, about the doom to cooperate. I mean, what's been destroyed are buildings and theaters, and it's horrific to watch, but also the world nuclear order has been destroyed. And what emerges could go in different directions. I wanted to, Professor Falk, you spoke about continuing to move with the General Assembly Treaty, but at a minimum, the ability for small groups of scientists to collaborate. There's no communication, it seems, at this moment, which is so dangerous. So I wanted to ask both of you how you would see, in a modest way, no hubris, but rebuilding the fractured, shredded infrastructure of arms control, which is not the abolition, but to continue moving in that direction. That's one. And what would you do about the normalization of nukes, which has been horrifying to witness in some of our media? How do we counter that as we try to build on this horrific war, try to end it, and try to rebuild the nuclear and the nuclear security framework?
Well,
I'd say last one leader, you mentioned the 4 men of the apocalypse, but there was a leader in Soviet history who was the highest, most powerful abolitionist, Gorbachev, who talked about we have to do the unimaginable if we don't want to confront the unthinkable. And also had a great phrase, as good as your weasel words, Governor. He talked about the squawk hawks who tried to oppose withdrawal from Afghanistan and opposed any nuclear measures in Russia. So it does take two to be partners.
Well, I'd say that it'd be nice to have a reinvigorated pugwash or more and more scientists getting together, credible people. It's time with people who have access because of their achievements, their notoriety, to talk about this issue. But it's not an issue people want to talk about. Certainly the Ukraine war can give a predicate here to talking about the danger of escalation to nuclear. And
Right.
Scientists ought to be talking about that. They're not. And unfortunately, Obama got a Nobel Prize for talking about getting rid of nuclear weapons or reducing them. But he was stymied by the same people. In fact, one of his key people writing his nuclear posture statement, Brad Jones, is quite articulate in his enthusiasm for the role of nuclear weapons. And I've talked to him many times, and he was the Democratic version. So now we got Biden. He has the same people. He couldn't even do a no first use, let alone starting to reduce in significant ways. We're not even on the playing field yet in terms of advancing the ball, if I could use that metaphor. We're not even on the 1 yard line. We have to go 100 yards down the road. So I think scientists, I don't think we're going to get a lot of politicians, but we got some retired ones, but even they're kind of quiet. I think Perry's been, they didn't get much of a resonance when he's spoken out. So I think we need more effort in response to the threat that Ukraine represents of escalation. And once you get even to a tactical nuclear weapon, people have said there's no obvious point of stopping. You can't be sure. And therefore, I think the time is urgent. The cause is obvious. And possibly that could move people to talk about this topic. But there's so many other issues that people are concerned about, whether they're on the right or on the left or some other categorization. They're worried about so many things, except the possible extinction of a good part of our civilization. So that's what, I don't like to sound like a doomsayer, but there are people like the fellow who wrote The Precipice, Toby Ord, who estimates that the odds on a total civilizational collapse, unrecoverable, is 1 in 6, Russian roulette. Now, maybe he's way off, but just to have somebody writing a book from Oxford on that topic ought to wake us up. But it doesn't wake us up. Maybe the Ukraine war, which risks getting out of hand, could wake up people, give urgency and impetus to meetings of scientists and other authorities that could wake up our political leaders on both sides of the Atlantic.
Thank you. Thank you.
Can I just add a word on one aspect of Katrina's question, which is, it seems to me that part of this closure of the mind that Governor Brown has been stressing has resulted from the media.
Mhm.
The media has played a very unfortunate role in acting as if there is no alternative
Right.
to a warmongering response to the Russian aggression. And it's exhibited no political imagination by inviting only retired military people and CIA people as so-called experts and giving no voice to critics. You're an exception. You've been published in the Washington Post a couple of times and done very creative articles and constructive ones. But overall, the media, until there's a slight shift maybe brought about by the Kissinger statement, there's a slight shift one notices in the New York Times and
Yes.
CNN, but it comes very much too late.
Yeah.
And it shows this kind of false consensus around this belligerent geopolitics that Governor Brown and I have been trying to emphasize.
Thank you, Dick. My column in the Post this week is just that, why there's no real debate about Ukraine and this consensus. I wrote it before Kissinger, and Newsweek today, I believe, has an article about Noam Chomsky and Kissinger agree.
Yeah, that shows you the state of our conventional leadership.
Yes,
They're
I know.
really way out. I was going to say in left field, right field. They're not in some kind of centered thinking about the world. They're not afraid. They're fearless fools for the most part. They don't have. They're one of the virtues There's 7 virtues of the Holy Ghost. I'll give you a little Roman Catholicism. One of those virtues is fear of the Lord. Fear of the Lord. That can be fear of nuclear annihilation, fear of the wrath of God. That used to be a virtue. Well, these guys running the show in all these countries, they're not fearful of the wrath that they are creating, perhaps unconsciously, but they should. There's something about that. You walk by a cliff. That's why Toby Ord called to the precipice. You ought to look over the side. I don't think they look over the side. I mean, they feel everything's fine. That's my feeling. I've talked to people. I've asked them. I called up. I was talking in my office about the danger of a nuclear accident, quoting Bill Perry. So somebody said, "You better talk to a regular general here. You're going off the deep end." So they got me in conversation with Colin Powell. God rest his soul. I called up Colin Powell and I said, "Perry says there's a problem with accident, miscalculation." I ran down a few of the ways that we could see initiation of a nuclear blunder. And every one of them, I think there were 4 or 5 of them, Colin Powell said, "Don't worry, deterrence holds in Pakistan. Don't worry, the army has the nukes under control." He poo-pooed. He felt totally confident, at least in his conversation with me. And so I called back Bill Perry. I said, "Bill, Colin Powell is not worried." And Bill said, "Perry is worried." Well, I'm not sure Biden is worried. I'm not sure that McConnell is worried. I don't know. They don't seem to be. They seem to be floating along. When they use that word extended deterrence, like it's some theological doctrine or some damn thing. It's pretty serious stuff. It's blowing away tens of thousands of people in some non-nuclear war. It's a nuclear first. It's a first use for sure. And yet that's our doctrine. That stopped Obama and that stopped Biden from having a nuclear posture, including no first use.
Thank you, Katrina, and thank you, Governor Brown and Richard, for taking us deeper into all of this, and also this, reminding us of Bill Perry's deep concerns, who's greatly impacted me as well. And he says that we're sleepwalking, and so I think our leaders are sleepwalking. I would just put that out. I think on the danger, that they're not really aware of it. And it goes to Richard's call for the need for civil society to awaken in this moment and to act, as you said, Governor Brown, like we did in the 1980s, where we had 1 million people in the streets. Governor Brown, I have a question for you from Hieko Tamura, and who's an 88-plus-year Hiroshima survivor, and should like your perspective on the role that survivors can play. What do you think they can do now to maybe help with this awakening?
Well, they certainly can be listened to. They have a very credible voice. I think it's a matter of creating forums to project the voice of those who survived Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I think it'd be good to get the children of the people like the Russian who didn't pass on the message that America had launched a nuclear attack. Petrov, I think his name was, whatever. We ought to hear from these people. The man in the submarine who overruled the Russian order to launch nuclear torpedoes against America during the American ships. Wow. And then Bill Perry, who was told that at 2 o'clock in the morning that the Russians had launched nuclear missiles, but he didn't believe it. And he didn't pass the message on. So there are heroes out there. There are dramatic situations, and we now have to promote that. But I have to tell you, there's so much media noise. Our brains are being bombarded with things we're supposed to care about, and they are very care-worthy. But the big threat of the Russia-U.S. confrontation and the emerging China-U.S. confrontation, that's big too. And we've got to get it on the front burner here along with climate. It's the same thing. We got to find ways to cooperate. And so it doesn't have to always be nuclear. It can be whatever. First, we got to start legitimating talk. Can Russians talk to Americans, or are we all now in our respective corners and can't talk at all? So, I mean, it's one, these sanctions, if they go far enough, it would be a complete hermetically sealed Russia. That's not so smart. So we need dialogue, and that's going to be up to civil society, media people. You know, we need the counterpart to Murdoch, who runs his media. We need the on the other side to counteract that insanity.
Thank you, Governor Brown. We have a question from our fellow board member, Rich Applebaum, that Zelensky seems unwilling to make a deal, or at least one that involves conceding the Donbass region. How to address this?
I don't see, I think there's going to be more killing, more fighting, more destruction. That's the way war works. But at the very least, America should have candid conversations with Zelensky about what's really possible. And I don't think I don't sense that clarity. I don't see it, but we need it. But there are most voices, as I say, it's like a football game, and hit them again harder. I used to be a cheerleader, used to lead that cheer. Hit them again harder. That's the way it sounds to me in Washington. Hit them again. Well, we better have somebody in the background, the back door, back channel, talking. What do we do? And keep opening that door. Now, I'm not saying Putin's going to be easy to deal with, and maybe it takes more strength. I mean, the Ukraine's shown courage and strength. So at some point, that should be a basis of negotiation. But you have to know how to win. You have to know how to accept a deal that's viable, other than just endless killing, like the trenches of World War I, where they just sat in the mud shooting machine guns at each other for many months. I just hope we can find a way to avoid that. It's going on, but now if our elders are thinking about it, and I'm not going to criticize too much, but I don't think America did as much as it could in preventing what's now happening from happening.
Let me add just a word. I think that very important at this stage is a constructive dialogue between the Biden administration and Zelensky. My impression is that when the U.S. shifted to this victory scenario from a resistance scenario, it also pulled Zelensky away from a openness to negotiations, which he had displayed early in the early period after the attack. And my sense is that he's, for good and maybe understandable reasons, he feels that his own posture toward the war has to follow the lead of Washington. And I think we're giving bad cues instead of trying to direct him in a way that he seemed inclined himself to prefer, until we shifted this focus of the war from defending Ukraine to defeating Russia. And that would be very important at this stage.
The problem with war is it stirs emotions, and anything that smacks of defeat or defeatism or appeasement, that puts a damper on discussion, on talk that's needed. And even to bring it up, I think even what I've said can be weaponized and distorted. But somehow there has to be serious back channel discussion, both with Zelensky and with Putin. They say that, I think one of our generals talked to one of their generals. That's good. But given the stakes, I think more needs to be done. Now, I don't know what's being done. I don't think we know. But it certainly appears from the public utterances that emotion is in the saddle when we need clarity and tough-minded realism to bring this conflict to the quickest and least damaging close that anybody can imagine, that reasonable people can imagine. Maybe that's not, maybe Putin wants to just keep fighting and it takes Zelensky to keep fighting back. I don't know. I always think that there's an opening somewhere that it will make more sense to do something less violent than not. But we don't know all the factors, and there's where we are.
Thank you, Governor Brown, for again reminding us, as you and Richard have said a number of times, about the importance for dialogue and mentioning the importance of back channel dialogues, which probably saved us during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So really, the back channel dialogues are so important, and we need to have those happening, and all kinds of communication need to be restored to reduce the risk here and to get us through this, to bring an end to the killing and bloodshed. I'd like to invite you both to share maybe your final words and anything you'd like to leave us with at this moment, and thank everyone for the questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them, but if you each would like to say something in closing, and then we'll wrap up. Thank you.
Well, I just say that the worst hasn't happened yet, so there's plenty of room to make things better. So Bill Perry once said to me, I said, "Are you optimistic?" And he said, "Yes." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because the future is uncertain. So we don't know what's going to happen. So we don't have to assume the worst. We can assume possibilities." And that's where I think our posture ought to be. And not only to assume them, but to work toward the most benign possibilities, or in a more negative way, the least destructive possibilities that we possibly can.
Thank you, Governor Brown. Richard.
I would just add that sooner is better than later. And that in the Vietnam War, for instance, the war went on needlessly for 5 or 6 years after Washington had more or less decided it had lost, the mission it had set out to achieve was not going to be successful. And therefore, there's a certain urgency about dialogue, both the dialogue, the constructive dialogue to the public, which I think is as important as the back channel, not leading to expectations of victory and of geopolitical mastery of the world, but rather working against that kind of public hubris that has characterized American foreign policy ever since the end of the Cold War. It's time that we saw the imperative, the prime imperative, to be one of cooperating to the extent possible with adversaries and creating the atmosphere that enables that to happen. And I hope that the nuclear danger is seen as the part of that iceberg that is most visibly threatening to the future of humanity.
Thank you, Governor Brown and Richard, for sharing your insights and wisdom at this truly dangerous moment for humanity. It's been very sobering and at once illuminating. And thank you for the call to action to wake up, to remember that we have agency, that civil society, it's time for us to really do what we need to do to change this, the course that we're on, and to have a chance to cooperate on all the other existential threats that are out there that we need to be working together with our adversaries to survive. I want to thank everyone who's joined us on the call today, for caring, for being with us for this existential conversation. Our next program on nuclear dangers will be over the summer, and we'll be posting details for that soon. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. And thank you, Governor Brown and Richard, for a truly really inspiring and, as I said, sobering conversation.
Thank you, Cynthia.
Thank you.